Hey, I want to talk about these guys today. This is an EGR solenoid. And a short time ago I made a video for my 85 Camaro tuned port dealing with what the potential replacement was for an EGR solenoid that goes bad. And on these tuned port cars, the part is no longer available. And I searched around, and you can go back and look at that video of mine. But I ended up with one of these, which is for a Cadillac, and plumbed it in and tested it and ran it on the Camaro and verified that it was good. And so that helps my tuned port Camaro friends out. But as I got digging in here, I kind of came to a realization that basically nearly all of the 80's passenger cars that General Motors produced, you know, Buick, Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Cadillac, Chevrolet, almost all of them have been discontinued from, you know, up to about 1988 or 89. All of the solenoids, you know, the cars are getting old enough that they've been discontinued. And I thought it was just a problem with the tuned port cars because they're maybe a little more, a little lower volume and a little less common. But it's like, no, the parts companies have been discontinuing a lot of them. So if you have an 80's car that's, generally speaking, computer controlled, you know, PCM, ECM controlled Chevy, Buick, Pontiac, Cadillac, Olds, and you fail one of these and your EGR is not working, you need to find a substitute. So what I'm going to tell you is, this is what you need to do to look for a substitute. And I've got a couple of possibilities. So the real story is, you know, what's next? You know, the parts are discontinued. What do we do now? As I said, as the cars are aging, they're discontinuing parts. So what does an EGR solenoid do? What does this part do? Well, it's an electronically controlled valve, and it's more than just on-off in most cases. They use something called pulse width modulation out of the controller, and they change the width of the signal. The length of time that the power is on. They turn power on and off very rapidly. And if you turned it on and never turned it off, you'd have like 12 volts continuous. If you went for if it was 1 second, right? And you went for a half a second and then off and then back for a half a second and then off for a half a second, that would be like a 50% duty cycle. So they do it with pulses. Anyway, that gives you the ability to do variable flow and more than just on and off. It controls the vacuum or the airflow to the EGR valve, and then of course it's controlled by the PCM. And if it fails, well then what? I mean, the first thing you could do is go look for salvage yard or look for eBay or somewhere used and buy a used one, and hopefully you find a good used one, and that may be a good solution. Or you can adapt a substitute part that was used on another car and try to get something that works. And again, I was successful here, but it takes a little work, and there are a lot of different models out there. The thing to think about with an EGR solenoid is there are actually two fundamental designs, and there's one that's normally open, which means if the power is turned off, it's open and it flows, and that's what I had on the Camaro, and that's the toughest one to find because that system was used early, and then as time went on, more and more of them went to one that's called normally closed. And normally closed is one that got used, you know, into the 2000s and even, and in the 90's. And it's more common, and it's easier to find a substitute if you have one of those. Here's a standard chart, and typically you'll find them under chart C7. If you find a General Motors service manual, all the EGR charts are C7, C7A, C7B, but they're all C7 of one or the other. So here you'll see is the EGR solenoid labeled NO for normally open. And this was from a 2.8 liter carbureted, and I believe this one was 1986 book that I had. And anyway, a manifold ported vacuum comes in and goes over to the EGR valve, and then the computer will tell this valve to close by energizing it and turn off the EGR, like when it's cold outside, or the engine's not warmed up yet, or there are all kinds of reasons, but the programming would close this one. These valves get 12 volt power through the ignition switch, through a fuse, through a connector, out to the solenoid. And then the computer over here, the computer grounds it. They show a picture of a switch going to ground. And so what the computer will do is close the switch, which then draws power through the circuit and brings it on through and closes it. And it can open and close this switch many times per second. It's an electronic switch, it's not mechanical. But this is an example of one that's normally open. So, which cars use which part? It's hard to say for sure. I have some service manuals, so I've kind of gone through my service information and I've picked out the ones from the catalogs and things that I've had available. So the tuned port cars from 85 to 92 use this one that I showed in my previous video. It's all normally open. The Corvettes tuned port cars, they're normally open. The Cadillacs, 45, 49, are normally open, and that's actually what this solenoid is. That's where I got it, is that one is the last normally open solenoid for a GM application that I could find available. All the other ones are discontinued. And I think this one's still here because it goes to 1995. Here's 1986, that 2.8 carbureted that I just showed. And then the 5 liter Olds, VIN Y and VIN 9, and B&E cars. And B&Es are LeSabres, 88s, Rivieras, and Tornados. And I'm not sure that whether these engines were used in the Riviera. They may have just been in the Tornado, but if you have one in one of those platforms, it should use that. I'm going to go back to the top, and I also didn't mention is the 305 carbureted engines in like 1985 and thereabouts also used a normally open solenoid. So if you went through and you found mid-80s 305 Chevys in other platforms, you likely have the same thing, but you have to check. You just don't know for sure. So then the normally closed, and this got to be more common with time. So when they went to port injected engines in particular, they started switching them over. So there's the 86, I had the Celebrity, the A body, port injected. The Skylark X body, 2.8 port injected. The 3 liter V6 in the Century, the A body, and that may be in other A bodies, but it just depended on where the 3 liter 6 went. The 3 liter 6 in the N body, which was a Buick Somerset or a Pontiac Grand Am if it was used in that one. The 3.8 turbos that were Riviera and Regal. The 3.8 in B bodies and G bodies. And then I don't remember what year they took the Camaro 305 to throttle body from carburetor, but that one, my 1991 book shows that 305 as the VIN E throttle body injected, having normally closed. And I think all of those engines had a normally closed one. And then I searched the trucks looking for normally open, and all the GM, GMC, Chevy trucks, all of those engines in the late 80s, early 90s, I couldn't find a normally open. Every one I looked at was a normally closed. Again, it's one of those things you need to check, and then, what about the ones that don't use one? And you probably aren't watching my video because you don't need it. But most of the 4 cylinders, 1.8s, 2s, 2.5s, that have EGR. The Quad 4 2.4 I don't think had EGR at all. It managed to meet emissions without it. But most of the ones, and this is a 2.5 liter, has this ported spark. When the throttle plate opens, you get vacuum, ported vacuum. And when you crack the throttle open, you get vacuum in here. It goes to the EGR valve, and the EGR valve works, and there's no solenoid. So it's just hard plumbed. And some of them could have a temperature switch in there, but none of the ECM control is running a solenoid on there. So back to the how can you tell part. If you think the solenoid's bad, it's really best if you can get a hold of a service manual or service information from somewhere and find chart C7. This particular one, since I wanted to give you a normally closed one, is for the Buick's 3/8 and 3 liter and 3/8, and it's a normally closed solenoid that the computer opens. This one and this is from 85. It has a diagnostic switch, so it'll set a code. Some of the early ones didn't set diagnostic codes for EGR. You just had to figure it out. But the later ones had various schemes, but this one had a diagnostic switch that measured vacuum. And if it wasn't getting vacuum because the valve wasn't opening, then it would pick that up and it would set a code. So how can you tell? Well, there could be some exceptions, but normally if it fails, it will normally fail in its powered off state. Usually the coil will fail, or I mean, you could get stuck. You could have a normally closed that sticks open, but the first try would be you can try to blow through it with your mouth, but they have a very small orifice in some of those. And so what I used in my last video was I went down to AutoZone and I did the loaner program where I paid them $55 for a couple days use, and then they gave me my $55 back when I took the tool back. But then I had this vacuum tool that I could pump, draw a vacuum and see that the system flowed or didn't flow. I could tell whether it was open or closed. And I'm going to go back to something for just a second. There generally, you have to watch these valves. There's an in and an out. And in addition to flowing air, they have a filter and they have a vent. Because when the solenoid valve closes, if you have vacuum on the EGR valve, you want that vacuum to bleed off so that the EGR valve closes. You don't want to lock it in there by closing the valve. So you'll see these will say that they've got a filter on them, and that filter's often on another port. So I'm going to go back to this one. The metal port was the inlet. It was what went to the vacuum source, to the throttle body. On the other side was the one that went to the EGR valve, and right next to it I've got the filter element removed, but there's a port right here where the filter went. And oftentimes these are close together, but you got to look and see and understand which one is what's in and what's out, right? All right, so then what could you use? What's the part that's available? Well, if you can go online and go to Standard Motor Parts. There are some other companies that sell these, but frankly, I've used Standard Motor Parts stuff for years. They have a pretty good selection, and oftentimes if they don't have it, it isn't there. And so this is a list. I'll show it in a couple of pages, but this is a list of every Buick, Olds, Chevy, Cadillac, Pontiac valve that's still available. And you can see that, it looks like 1987 is as far back as any of them go. And if you look at them, you'll see there's a popularity code over here, and I don't know exactly how that works, but it looks to me that A is probably very popular and they sell a lot of them, and Z is probably not real popular and are liable to be out of production soon because they're not very popular. And I draw that by one, logic, and two is if you look at what they're in. You know, like I think this VS12 is in like tons and tons and tons of GM pickup trucks, and so it would be pretty popular. And the ones at the bottom of the list are for, you know, 2 or 3 models that ran for 2 or 3 years. So here's some more. There's VS27, 37, you can go all the way down here. Now the one that I have in my hand that's a normally open is from the 95 Cadillac 4.9, and I think it goes back to 1988 or so. But this one's still available. It's a VS25 at Standard Motor Parts, about 75 bucks, and this worked perfectly successfully on my Camaro. You go back to look at my other video, I won't repeat everything, but I put miles and miles on it to make sure that it really worked and it didn't set codes. Good part. And so I'm going to keep this one on the shelf in case my original one never goes. Then I would suggest this VS18 as a potential replacement for any of the ones that are normally closed. And I picked this one. This one's a popularity F. It's not at the top of the list, but it's the one that's used on the throttle body 91 Camaro VIN E. You probably could use a number of other ones that are on the list that are used on the pickup trucks. This one I had data on. There are several things in selecting one of these solenoids. One is I'm suggesting is you stay with a GM application. Others may work from another company, but GM tended to do things in a common fashion. And so what you'll find in all the service information is that all of these solenoids, what they'll tell you is, if you find a solenoid coil, or a relay coil, or a fuel injector coil that's less than 20 ohms, it's bad. Replace it, or you may damage your ECM. So all of the driver circuits tend to be in the same range. My solenoid on the Camaro, the factory one, was about 25 ohms. This one is about 35 ohms. It's close, and it ran just fine. And I expect that the way GM mixed and matched controllers between engines, I expect you wouldn't hurt your computer by changing this solenoid if it's above 20 ohms of resistance. I can't guarantee that, but I was willing to take the risk on mine for this. Now, when you're going to adapt it, the first thing is, you may find that the connector is different. My original one had the weather pack style, and this one has, I think it's called Metra Pack. It's a different connector. This was a S575. But if you go to Standard's catalog, they will tell you what the pigtail is that plugs into that, so that you can order one of these and buy a pigtail and wire it in. Vacuum hoses may be different. On the Camaro, they've had a molded rubber connector that went over 2 terminals simultaneously on the valve. And so, I had to get some plastic jumpers to go into that fitting and then go into a regular rubber hose. So you have to look at your application and figure out what kind of jumper, buy a piece of jumper hose and connect it in. And then the third one is brackets, because one of the things that makes these all different is on every engine they mounted it just a little differently on a different bracket to clear something. And you may have to make your own bracket. On my Camaro, I think if I wanted to use this, I could take this stud out of here, and I could probably run a bolt through it and I could probably screw it down. For testing, I just wire tied it to taped it actually to the air conditioning line so it couldn't go anywhere. You probably want to be fancier than that. You probably don't want it to rattle around forever, but you may have to make a piece of sheet metal bracket or something to get it hooked up. So that's my best advice is, take a look at the service information. You can take that solenoid and blow air through it, or get a vacuum pump and pull air through it and verify whether it's normally open or closed, assuming that it's not stuck in between. Get the right wire, the right connector. One last thing is watch out for polarity. Most coils have something to suppress spark and arc energy when the switch opens. And sometimes they're diodes and sometimes they're just resistors, but diodes don't like to be hooked up backwards. So on the end of this valve, there's a plus sign near one of the terminals. And your original valve, I can say the original valve on here, had a plus sign on one of the terminals. So you want to figure out, which one is the 12-volt feed coming in here, and make sure that if you got a replacement, that you hook it up the same way. Just one very last thing. Again, when I was doing the Camaro, if you go back and look at that video, but I used a 9-volt battery, just one of the little rectangular ones, and connected the wires across that 9-volt battery, and I could make this with 9 volts. I could make that switch on and off, and I could hear it click, and when I ran the little vacuum pump, I could see that it was either flowing or it wasn't flowing, depending on whether I had power on it or not. And if you're testing your own part to see whether it's good, might be worth a try. Just watch that polarity, make sure positive goes to positive, and so forth. I hope that helps. That's all for now.